let me introduce Bridget Butler, known as the Bird Diva.
Yes, that's right.
It's all yours.
Thank you. So thank you to the Georgia Historical Society for having me here tonight. This is the first time I've gotten to speak in Georgia, so this is really cool for me. My name's Bridget. I live in St. Albans. I have a husband, a cat, a dog, and 3 kiddos. I'm the only birder in my family. Pretty much. It kind of rubs off on everybody else at this point. And I consider myself an enthusiast, not an expert. But some people might put me in other categories as we're out in the field. So my background is that I used to work for Audubon, Vermont. I used to work for Audubon, New Hampshire, and Audubon, Maine, and Audubon, Massachusetts as well. So I've kind of made my way all over New England. And it wasn't until I came to Vermont that I really fell in love with birds. I found most birders, the first time I ever met them, to be obnoxious and competitive, and they really weren't very fun to hang out with. And so I wanted to make sure that as I fell in love with birds, that I was going to be able to share my passion and my excitement for birds. So I try to stay in that beginner's mind all the time. And so tonight what I'm going to try to do is get you thinking about the excitement that happens around birds during this time of year, because it's the fall migration. And it's kind of a really magical thing that happens. We think about all of these. Some birds are really large and they're moving, and some birds are very, very small and they're going long, long distances. So we're going to talk a little bit tonight about how they do that, and hopefully have some cool pictures. And I encourage you to share stories as we go along as well. So we're going to kind of fall into autumn. These are some of the things that we'll talk about. So we're going to talk about the time to fly. Why is it the time to fly right now? How do they know when it's time to fly? We'll talk about challenging fall warblers. I don't like to call them confusing. We'll talk about why some people think they're confusing. I like to think of them as a challenge, like this little guy, the little palm warbler right here. We'll talk about kettles of raptors, which is like totally happening right now. It's very exciting. Over the next couple of months, we'll get larger rafts of waterfowl, so we'll talk about some of those guys. I'm going to share 2 stories with you from the Vermont Center for Eco Studies about resilient birds and some of the science that's coming out of little, teeny, tiny old Vermont. That's really quite amazing. And then to wrap up, we'll talk a little bit about how you can pay it forward for birds. And so if you're passionate about birds and you're connecting with birds in your backyard, what are some of the things that you can do to help keep them on the landscape? Okay, so I'm going to start with a little question for you. How many of you consider yourself a birder? A birder. I'm a birder. I go out.
What's the definition?
I know. Well, I'm seeing this is what I love. I don't tell people what the definition really is. So if you were like, yeah, I'm a birder. Oh, okay. I got a couple in here. I know there's other. I'm like looking at a couple other people.
Yeah, I'm a
Wannabe birders. It's really interesting because a lot of people do that too. No, I'm not really a birder. Are you a bird watcher?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so raise your hand if you're a bird watcher.
I know.
All right. Yeah, look, everybody's so much more comfortable with that. Isn't that odd? It's kind of strange. They're really kind of the same thing when it comes right down to it. How many of you have bird feeders? Okay. How many of you have heard about a bird somewhere and gone to see it? Okay. How many of you have purposely gone on a walk to look for birds? All right. How many of you have gone on a trip, like away out of Vermont to go see birds? Okay. Oh, a couple. There we go. There we go. Good. How many of you are just happy when you cross the path of a bird? Yeah. Good. Me too. So there's all different ways in to enjoy this, and I welcome all of those different ways. It's not just about being a birder or a bird watcher or a bird feeder. It's about enjoying them kind of when they present themselves to us and enjoying what they can reveal. So this is kind of a, I don't know, happy, sad photo? What do you think of when you see that photo? How do you feel?
Great, my kids have left home.
There we go. So this is kind of a quintessential end of summer shot where there's nobody left in the nest, right? Everybody's flown, everybody's out of that spot. And as we move into the end of summer, we start to see some of these little guys. Anybody know who this is? Yeah, so this is a juvenile robin going, feed me, feed me. So they look different. Our juvenile birds look a little bit different. They look a little bit scruffier. Maybe not all of the feathers have grown in yet. And sometimes they look a lot different because they don't have their adult feathers in. And as we move through the season and we get towards fall and the colors start to change, the birds start to change too, and their behaviors start to change. And we get into that time of year where the birds that have delighted us, some of those birds all summer, they're going to leave and move to this other world that they spend in the wintertime, this place. And we think of them as our birds, but they're somebody else's birds too. They just kind of have these dual lives, which is really pretty cool. So how do they know when, right? How do they know when? And what I love is you can look through all kinds of research and no one's really sure what is going on quite yet when it comes to birds and migration. But one of the things that we can start to pay attention to, that we pay attention to, are the seasonal changes that are beginning to happen. So when I think of birds, this is a really great kind of graphic to think about how the seasons change and what birds are doing during the different time of year. So blue is molting, this golden yellow is fattening, green is breeding, and red is migrating. So we have 2 times a year, autumn and spring, right, across from each other when we're in the midst of migration. And there's all these great things that kind of happen in between, right? So we have this blue is molting, and the gold again is fattening, right? So you've got to make sure your feathers are in good shape before you're going to fly north to your breeding grounds, and you've got to fatten up to do that, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And it's same on the flip side here, August. So as we're in June and July, this is that breeding time. The birds come back in May, they establish their territories. We get all that beautiful song that happens. And as we move through the summertime, as they start to have their babies, we start to hear begging calls from the fledgling birds as they're trying to get their parents to continue feeding them, and their parents are trying to say, nope, it's time for you to feed yourself. Watch what I do. Please do the same thing. And then it gets really quiet across the landscape as we move into August. And this is the time of year when birds are starting to molt, and the juvenile birds are really trying to hold their own and really get ready for some of them to make these treks of very, very long distances. September is the time to fatten up, and we're going to talk about how fat is fat enough to make some of these journeys. It's really pretty amazing, and one of the things that we can do is make sure that there's native plants and food available for them, whether it's our bird feeders or whether it's the viburnums and the dogwoods and the sumac and the acorns and all of that we can keep on the landscape for them. And as we get into the end of October and November, a lot of our migrant birds have shifted out, and we're going to talk about all of those birds. The big cue for them is really the change in light, which is a cue for us, right? My kids are like, I'm getting up in the middle of the night. And I'm like, no, it's morning, it's time to go to school. It's just really dark out. And soon we'll get to the end of the days when it's darker earlier, right? Well, the birds key in on those photo cues as well. But the biggest thing is food available for them. So as those natural food sources start to disappear across the landscape, whether it's insects or nectar, birds that can't find that food source again have to move on and have to go elsewhere. And the thing that really starts to hit them is this thing. Anybody want to give a shot at pronouncing that word? So as we move into this time of day, a lot of the birds that want to be migrating start feeling sukunruha.
Oh,
Sukunruha. There we go. It's a German word that means migratory restlessness. Basically, it's this whole thing that starts to happen in the bird's body where their internal clock shifts, and it changes from sleep at night and feed and forage during the day to eat a lot during the day and move at night. So they start to feel this feeling of restlessness. And there are actually physiological changes that go along with it, where they can actually eat a lot more, and their brain space kind of changes in order to be able to do that. So hyperphagia is a really, really interesting thing. So I'm going to read this to you. so that you know what I'm talking about. So hyperphagia means you're going to eat a lot, and you're going to almost eat too much. And that's what these migratory birds need to do. They need to be able to bulk up, because some of them, as you'll see in some of the maps that I'm going to show you, are going to fly long distances out over water. They're not going to be able to stop and eat. So they have to have all the fat reserves in their body. So if you are a 175-pound person, you need to gain 60% of your body weight in 2 weeks. 2 weeks.
Wow.
You would have to eat 46 Big Macs per day for 14 days in order to increase your body weight to the weight that you need to be able to have the fat reserves to migrate. So most birds need to increase their weight by 50%, and they do so by eating a whole lot before migration starts and at stopover sites. So where some birds are just moving through Vermont and they're going to keep going on, there are spots where they're going to stop and need to feed. So keeping native plants on the landscape is really important. So we have 2 different kinds of berries, especially, that are available for birds. Some berries provide lots of sugar, like our blackberries and our raspberries, things like that. So that's the burst of energy that birds need to be able to carry on. And then there's other shrubs and plants that are high in carbohydrates and lipids, so the fats, and that's the fatty tissue that these birds are going to put on their body. So things like dogwoods and viburnums are really good for that. Plants that we want to get off the landscape, because they kind of have this, well, diuretic effect on the bird, where the bird eats it and it just passes through its body really quickly, are things like buckthorn and Asian honeysuckle. So those 2 plants, even though they have berries on them, and we watch the birds eating them, they have no nutritional value. And they actually, on the landscape, outcompete those native plants. So whenever we can, if we can remove those from the landscape and replace them with some of our native plants, we're going to be doing some really great things for all of these birds. Like Cape May warbler, this is Virginia creeper right here. Make sure you know the difference between Virginia creeper and poison ivy, because they're both vines and they kind of look a little bit the same. Virginia creeper has a set of 5 leaves instead of a set of 3. However, birds will eat the poison ivy berries as well, so leave those in place, and maybe that's a good deterrent for people like walking off a trail or whatnot. All right. Catbird here, this is a catbird eating dogwood berries. This is a thrush, and this might be like winterberry, I think, is likely. Some birds, like the warbler here, they're actually insectivores during their breeding season, and then they switch to becoming frugivores, or fruit eaters, during migration, and sometimes on their wintering grounds as well. So they shift and adapt to be able to find what they need. I have a lot of people ask me, oh man, what about the hummingbirds? Am I going to keep them? Am I going to keep them here because I keep my nectar feeders out, or when are they going to leave? And we can really look at the cues across the landscape to understand when they're going to leave. So when native plants like jewelweed start to die off with the first frost that comes through, that's when the hummingbirds are going to start to push on and move. Now hummingbirds don't just eat nectar, they eat lots and lots of insects, about 2,000 individual insects a day. I don't know who the researcher was that counted that, but that must have been a very interesting job. So they have this balance. The same thing happens with insects. As we get into frost, those are going to decrease on the landscape as well. So the birds that really have these special diets, especially when they rely on insectivores, are the ones that are going to move on. They're going to try to bulk up and get as much fat on their body as possible before they leave. So let's talk about some different types of migration, because there's actually a lot of different kinds when it comes right down to it. So we have our permanent residents. We have birds that stay here all year round, and they're the ones that are able to still find food, and they're the ones that are able to cope with the cold temperatures that we have. So birds like chickadees and tufted titmouse and cardinals, those guys are all going to stay on the landscape and most likely be the same birds that we've seen all summer. They might shift a little bit here and there depending on how the winter weather hits a particular area, but they are our permanent resident birds. Then we have short distance migrants. Anybody know this one?
Junco?
Yeah, junco. So do we have a lot of juncos around right now?
No.
No. You know where they all are?
North.
Up in the mountains or up further north. So this is a bird that moves from higher elevation to lower elevation between the spring and fall migration. So they're considered short distance migrants. They're not going to go too far. They may just shift where they are on a small scale on the landscape. Middle distance migrants like this guy, these guys are so noisy now. Are you hearing these guys?
Oh my God.
They are like posseing up together and just like terrorizing neighborhoods. They're like the loudest birds out there right now. So blue jays actually do form these little kind of gregarious social groups right now. And they kind of go around and they're figuring out where they're going to be. But what's interesting about blue jays is they're a shorter distance migrant. So they may just go a state over. And what tends to happen when you look at the breeding range for blue jays, right? So the western jays move a little bit further west. And the eastern jays move a little bit further east. Okay, so when you look at that breeding range map, these guys actually move like east and west rather than north and south. Of course, if there's a good mast crop, if there's good beechnut or acorn in other spots, that's where they're going to move to. So that's one of their preferred winter foods. So middle distance, you can think of like, I'm going to move a state over or a state down, okay, for middle distance migrants.
Is that, I'm
Yes.
sorry,
No,
you said that's for breeding?
for breeding.
I'm sorry, for the middle
Migration.
distance, it's just, why are they moving?
Why are they moving? It's
Over?
food related. Yep.
Okay.
It's going to be food related. Yep. And so they'll just move short distances. The long distance migrants are the ones that are leaving the continental U.S. So they're going to go to South America, Central America, Haiti, Dominican Republic, places like that. So their world really changes drastically, which is really pretty amazing. So that's the way that we can think about it. People often ask me about robins. Where would you put robins in that?
Short?
Permanent and short, sure, both places.
Yeah, I know, right? Like both places, right? So I think of them as permanent, but it's very possible that the robins that we see here during the winter aren't our breeding robins, that our breeding robins have shifted and moved elsewhere. I think there's still some room for some studies on that because I find it really interesting, the huge numbers. And actually, it was in Georgia by the lake. I think it was 2 years ago during migration. I can't remember. It must have been fall migration. The robins tend to start to flock together. They form these social groups, and they're kind of working the Champlain Valley area up and down the lake in the lowlands along the lake, where they're finding more berries and fruits and things like that that are persistent through the winter. And I'm really curious, like, are those our robins, or are they robins that are a little bit from further north or further west or further east? So how are they moving? But yeah, I would put them somewhere. I'd like circle this, maybe almost middle. And the winter has a lot to do with it too. Goldfinches are a resident bird, but if the snows get really deep and heavy and they cover up all the seed sources that are out there, then they will shift and move with food. Some of the ways that scientists have been able to map where birds are going, they start to break them down, especially the long distance migrants, into these different flyways. So where we are, we're kind of in this Atlantic Americas flyway. There's a Mississippi flyway, and then there's a Pacific flyway. If you're a duck hunter, there's a fourth flyway. So let's see, this, and I got the slide for it later on. So the fourth one is somewhere in the middle here. It's like the central one. So most of our understanding about how birds migrate has come from waterfowl. Waterfowl are a little bit easier to study than little teeny tiny songbirds, except for the science that is out there right now, which is really awesome, which I will tell you about in a little bit. So most of our knowledge comes from how waterfowl move, but we're beginning to start to understand how birds use some of these flyways. And here in Vermont, the patterns that they like to follow are down Lake Champlain, right? That's a really great spot to follow. The spine of the Green Mountains. The Connecticut River is another one as well. And if you think about birds needing good stopover spots where they're going to be able to find food, you think of those different types of habitat, those edge habitats, or those wetland habitats that might be in each of those kind of zones as the birds move across the state. All right, so this is awesome. This report was literally just released, I think this earlier and end of last week. It's been sitting in my mailbox waiting for tonight.
Yeah.
So this is some research from some scientists at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. It was just published in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution. And thanks to some of the technology that's out there right now, especially in terms of radar, weather radar, and how we can use weather radar, also how we're able to predict weather a little bit better now. We have all of this information that can tell us a little bit more about how many birds are actually moving during each of the migration periods during the year. So here's what's really cool, and I'm going to grab my notes for this because this is all new data. So up at the top, we're looking at how birds are moving across the landscape during autumn and spring. And so we're going to talk specifically about this yellow, okay? So birds that are kind of our short distance or middle distant migrants, the ones that are going to stay within North America, there's about 4 billion birds that make this move through this part of the country. Then there's another 4.7 billion birds that are moving from here and heading to Mexico, Central and South America. So that's fall migration. They've actually been able to kind of pinpoint the number of birds. So we could say 4 billion birds moving during fall migration. The crazy thing is that, and this is not what most of the researchers expected, is on the trip back, we're getting about 3.5 billion birds. The ones that are neotropical migrants, the ones that are going to the tropics, we're actually getting more of those back than the ones that stay within North America. So here's 2.6 billion birds from that 4 billion that moved. So what's interesting is that it's not the resident or short or middle distance migrants that are surviving the winter better, it's actually the ones that are traveling a longer distance. So here's what's kind of fascinating about that too. The bummer part about that is that if you are a neotropical bird and some devastating event happens, like say a hurricane, right? Because you have less young than resident birds do each year, there's more of a chance that a weather event like that can have an impact on your population than the winter birds. Our resident birds have more babies each year, so they'll have like 8 babies and they'll fledge maybe 6 of them, right? The neotropical migrants have fewer birds, have fewer young, so maybe 4 eggs and maybe 2 make it to fledge. And so if there is a devastating weather event or other type of habitat shift, so say down in the in Haiti, or well, let's not use the islands because they get hammered by hurricanes all the time, but let's say one of the forests down in Brazil or Colombia gets converted to, I don't know, agriculture, right? Those birds that came to that forest there, that's a devastating impact for that population and may not allow them to survive. So it's really kind of interesting, the science that has just come out. The other great piece of this is that now it allows us to better read the skies and know what's happening kind of in the moment. So Cornell has taken, so let me back up. For about 75 years, we have used weather data to figure out when the birds are migrating. And the way that you did it is you went online, you went to NOAA, and you pulled up the weather radar. And at night, you would watch it right around this time when birds are starting to take off for the night and begin to fly, to migrate. And you would watch the weather radar for that. So blue would be birds taking off and entering into the radar to be picked up. And green would be precipitation. So we could look at it and predict, well, there's a good flight, a good migratory flight tonight, so tomorrow morning is probably going to be really good for birds. What's even better now is you don't have to go in there and do all that and learn how to adjust everything, is the folks at Cornell are doing it for us. And they're also using weather data to be able to predict out 3 days when migration is going to be good. So this is for tonight. Look at this. This is for tonight. This is how cool this is. So, right, so high, medium, low, no migration. And they give you 3 days at a time when you go to the website. So we are in the orange, red, yellow zone here. So it's likely tomorrow that we could get up and go out birding and see a bunch of warblers or a bunch of vireos. have numerous birds on the landscape that are coming down to forage during the day. So, the next couple days aren't gonna be so good though. You can see we get into the cool blue area in here. The gray on here is precipitation. And so it's really interesting, look where the precipitation is. South of that, it's all blue. But north of that, they're gonna take advantage of that and take off and kind of follow the storm out, which is really kind of interesting. So you used to have to think really hard to figure out when it was gonna be good to bird, and now you don't have to do that anymore. You just have to go on Birdcast and be like, great. What's even more fun, and you can get this to animate, so this was last night, and I grabbed this screenshot. You'll see, this is 8 o'clock, around 8 o'clock at night. Does it have the time on here? Yeah, right here. So September 18th, around 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. This is the migration traffic rate, so the whiter it is, the more migration is happening. The little green dots are the radar stations that are all over the country, so we've got one right up here, which is really great in our zone. And then the orange arrows kind of tell you where the direction that the birds are starting to move in. So the line here, this red line, is sunset happening, and when you animate this, that red line moves across the screen and shows you, and everything changes, and so that white and dark moves for you. So you can actually sit there at your computer and be like, they're all in the sky right now. And the ones that are in the sky are actually the smaller songbirds, our perching, passerine birds. These guys like to fly at night because it's cooler, the atmosphere is more stable for their bodies, and none of the predator birds are out for them at night. So when we get a good full moon, I don't know how close we are to full moon, one of the ways that ornithologists used to study migration rates and get an idea of how many birds were moving is they did full moon counts, where they would have somebody go out and sit when there was a full moon, and the person would count how many little shadows of birds they saw go past the moon through a scope or through their binoculars.
Wow.
That used to be the cool thing to do.
Talk about
Now we don't have to do that anymore. We just stay inside and pull it up on our computer. No, it's actually really great to go out on a full moon night. If you listen carefully, you know, the songs that we hear, birds, that we know birds for, the breeding, the mating songs, are really wonderful. But this time of year, there's something magical about going outside. If the radar is telling you to go outside and listen. And you, not over that guy, you won't hear it over that guy. But go out and listen, and you'll hear the little chip and sit notes of the birds staying in touch with one another as they're moving and migrating. So really pretty amazing where technology has brought us. And then when you get out there, these are two birds that you really want to pay attention to. So say the radar is like, yes, go out tomorrow morning, you want to go and see what you're going to find on the landscape. One of my mentors, Fred Pratt from the Mad Birders, those are the bird crew in the Mad River Valley. Fred was the one that taught me a lot about warblers. Brian Pfeiffer said, you need to meet Fred, and you should go birding with Fred because he's really great. Fred told me, Bridget, always pay attention to the chickadees during migration. He's like, they are the ambassadors for the birds that are moving through. So chickadees form these social flocks. They form mixed social flocks, so often we see them with tufted titmice and nuthatches and everything. So then as our songbirds come down to rest during the day, which really isn't resting, it's more about that hyperphagia thing, again, just eat, 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 eat. I'll sleep when I get to Mexico. They hang out with the chickadees and the titmice because they're moving across the landscape foraging, and they don't have to think about finding food because the chickadees are helping them do it. So it's really, really cool. So how many of you know chickadee call? Chickadee-dee-dee, right? Dee-dee. And they do little sit notes too to each other. Pay attention to that and make sure every single one of them is a chickadee because it's likely they're not going to be. There'll be a warbler or a vireo or somebody else mixed in there as well. Top secret, don't tell anyone that tip. All right. So I told you we were going to talk a little bit about warblers. These are small songbirds. They are neotropical migrants, so they're going to Central and South America for the winter. And what's crazy about these guys is, so when we have our first year birds, a lot of our first year birds that have just been born this year they don't look like the adults. So they're drabber in color. It's gonna take them a year to get their adult plumage, which both of these birds have their nice adult plumage. So this is common yellowthroat. It's a warbler that likes shrubby, scrubby habitats. Magnolia warblers tend to like habitats that are more forested and have more conifers in them. Now, you throw all of that out during this time of year. Don't worry about habitat association because they end up in my backyard, which is really great. And I'm in downtown St. Albans, so I'm always looking. But they might look a little bit different. They might look something like that. So you can just see shades of the male common yellowthroat. This is the male. I'm giving you all the males. The females are equally challenging. But so you can just see a hint of the mask in here. There's not much of that gray-white line over the top of the mask. But the yellow throat is still there as well. And we can't see the undertail cover. It's that little kind of triangle that's where the body and the tail meet. But a lot of times that is still going to be the same as well. And you'll be able to kind of key in on who's who off of that. And then Magnolia warbler, look at that. Wow. Just a little bit more washed out. And look at this, and there's an eye ring, where here it's just a little bit of a partial eye ring and an eyebrow. Not there yet. The wing bars, these are very like minimal wing bars, whereas when it becomes an adult and it molts, that spring molt, it's going to get this huge fat wing bar right in there. You're going to have a little bit of a clue because it's going to have a little bit of flex on the side. And then the part that I like that really helps me with magnolias all the time is this white little undertail coverage here. And you can just barely see it on this one. Is the tail is like dipped in black, and then the base of the tail is white. So there are little pieces that you can hold on to, but part of the challenge of the fall is that it's this mixed bag of juveniles and non-breeding adults that it's just like, wow, there's so much more, but you just have to figure out the mystery of who's who. Okay, I'm gonna give you the two hardest ones. Not when they're breeding, right? Those two don't look alike at all, do they? So we have bay-breasted on the left and black-poll warbler on the right. Bay-breasted is kind of a boreal forest, spruce fir forest kind of bird. We'll find them in the Northeast Kingdom. They do breed in northern Vermont. And then black-poll warbler is a warbler that breeds on high mountain tops and the higher elevations. Almost looks like a chickadee, but not quite, a little bit smaller. When they are their non-breeding plumage, they look like that. You get a little bit of the rustiness on the side and the wing bars. This is just starting to come in, but watch this. What? They almost look alike, don't they? And here's what's even worse. They like to migrate together. Oh, but it can be so much fun. So here are some things that when you really fall into birding that you could start to look for. I always look for this, the little rusty, they call it the bay color. On the side, under the wings, there'll be a little bit of a blush to that. Sometimes that's really hard to pick up on because the lighting isn't right. The other piece is this eye, the eye ring is a little bit more prominent than this one. This one tends to be more broken because, this is my big clue for being able to tell the two apart, is there's a bit of a stronger eye line, that black line through the eye. And this, the black-poll tends to have a little bit more streakiness down the side than the bay-breasted warbler does. But again, challenging, don't get confused, like take it on as a challenge. Sometimes one of the things that happens with these birds, did anybody experience fog anywhere around here over the weekend? I was in the Northeast Kingdom by Wallace Pond, and it was totally socked in with fog in the morning. And I was like, yes, because you know what that does to all the songbirds? It pushes them down, right? And there are times when the birds will literally feel like they're falling out of the sky, and birders call this fall out, when the weather just pushes the birds down immediately. And they're everywhere. Like, you can't look without seeing a warbler doing this, right? And they're all over the place. So my advice is pick one bird. Don't get distracted by all the other ones. And it can be really overwhelming. My heart rate always goes up. Somebody needs to, like, put a blood pressure cuff on me or something during warbler fallout and see what that does. And I have to remind myself, pick one bird, stay with one bird as long as you can, and get as much information out of them, and then you'll have a chance to be able to figure out what you've got, especially when it comes to their challenging plumages during this time of year. Anybody experienced a little bit of fallout this year? Oh, yeah, here and there, yeah. Over at the refuge, maybe up at some of the town forests. My backyard, crazy enough, it could be right in your backyard that it's happening. So again, listen for those chickadees and then go out and check. All right, now we're going to move and we're going to shift to a whole other group of birds, which is very exciting during this time of year. So this is, this look the whole time when these birds start migrating. So we have raptor migration that happens now. So September through maybe about the second week in October tends to be really good. It's when we have these warm days and cool nights. So what raptors like to do is they like to take advantage of the thermals along the mountains. One of the hard things when raptors are way up in the sky is that you can't see any of the plumage, right? You don't get to see the beautiful belly band all the time on the red-tailed hawk. You don't get great looks at the banding on the tails. So one of the things you can start to train your eye to are the silhouettes of the different birds. So we start to look at how do the birds hold their wings and the shape of the wing, okay? Which is very different from this bird to this bird. Size can be very deceiving because if the sharp-shinned hawk and the turkey vulture are different distances from us, sometimes it's hard to tell who's the giant bird and who's the really small bird. But these features don't ever change. That's the other thing that's great about using silhouettes, is that the general shape of the bird's body won't ever change where the plumage will. And you may not always get a chance to see that. Look at how far the head sticks out beyond the leading edge of the wing, or the tail's length in relation to the body length, in relation to the length of the head. So whenever we start to think about size, what we can start to do is start to think about sizes of parts of the body in relation to other parts of the body. So falcons tend to have these long, kind of very linear tails, very angular, triangular wings, and their heads are tucked in a little bit in comparison to other birds. All right, I'm going to quiz you in a minute, but let's talk about how they get where they need to go. So these guys are using thermals. So there's this updraft that happens on mountainsides, and as the air warms during the day, it rises, right? And it's going to hit a spot in the sky where it's going to cool off. So basically what these birds do is they take advantage of these updrafts, they ride the thermals, and they spiral through them, and we call that a kettle. And what happens is this bird's going to see these guys and be like, yes, there's a thermal. And he's going to like soar over here, and he's going to join this group. And what ends up happening, like on a really awesome day, is you get hundreds and hundreds of them spiraling up in these kettles. And then when they get to the point in the air where it's cool, that's where they dump off of the top of the kettle, and they shoot south. And so you watch this spiraling, and then it's like 1, 2, 3, 4 that just peel off the top. So places to go in Vermont for this are Mount Philo. So that's the closest one to us. Although I don't doubt that there are some mountains that we could be missing out on hawk migration here, just because it's not considered a hot spot yet. Branbury State Park, what is it? Rattlesnake Cliffs, and I don't even know. Anybody know where Branbury State Park is? Where is that? What town? Brandon. Okay, awesome. And then keep going. Putney Mountain is the one that is the most well-known hawk watch site. And in fact, over the weekend, they had 2,436 broadwings counted. That's close. I looked at the numbers today. So it was in the 2,000 broadwing hawks that went by over a period of 7 hours with the counters there. So really fun. Go take a day trip. Go down to Mount Philo. There'll be some birders there. Kind of build. This is the other nice thing about hawk watches is you don't have to get up early. So it's like get up at 10 and drive down to Philo, and all the action starts around noon, right? So you're like, I like this kind of birding. I don't have to get up really early in the morning to do this. And there'll be folks there that can kind of help you kind of fine tune your eye to who's there. I kind of make it easy with some of these pictures because I'm going to give you the plumage as well. So this is a really nice shot of the most common hawk that we see migrating during this time of year.
It's a red tail.
No.
It's a broadwing. So actually, red tails kind of stick around through the winter as long as they can. Broadwings really start to leave. So broadwing and red tails are very similar because they're both in the Buteo group in terms of their shape and size, fairly close. Because of the way their wings are shaped, that's that broad wing, that little bump, and then the roundness at the bottom, rounded on the edges too here. Tail is different, this one is kind of wedged off, but this guy's in like full spread tail mode. See this like stocky body too? Really robust stocky body on the broad wing. And the other big clue here are these nice bands, very thick broad bands on the broad wing hawk.
Oh,
Gorgeous. Okay, let's try another one. Ah, that one's a little farther up. And then it's got this lighting coming through. But we see not a lot of head and a long tail.
I'm going with turkey.
Yeah, so it's not a sharpshin, but it's the one that everybody confuses with sharpshin. This is Cooper's hawk, right? So you could say Cooper's or sharpshin and you'd be in a really good spot. So that long tail, it's almost like the tail is longer than the body. This is an accipiter. These guys are the fast-moving birds that bomb through trees and grab songbirds and eat them. So they're designed to be able to do that. And then you get days that are like this, and you're just like, that's like salt, and that's like pepper. Somebody just threw a whole bunch of pepper in the sky, and I don't know what it is. So you just kind of lay down. And don't worry about it, and you just enjoy all the acrobatics going overhead. Anybody know that birder? That's Brian Pfeiffer. He's the author of Bird Watching in Vermont. I had the pleasure of a couple of great mentoring adventures with him, and he helped me along the way a great deal. I think we were on a break looking at gulls on Lake Champlain. So speaking of Lake Champlain, and Georgia is right on the lake. There's some good stuff going on there. This is one of my favorite ducks. Pintails, just gorgeous, right? The patterning. So we have the male and the female and same here. So October through the beginning of December are great times for ducks that are moving through. Some birds are moving from inland lakes to the seashore, so they're going to the ocean. Some birds are just kind of trying to move to where there's still going to be open water. We do have waterfowl on Lake Champlain throughout the winter. You just have to go to where the water's open. I lead a trip, I think it's January or February. I do a waterfowl trip with the St. Albans Recreation Department. We take a van and cruise all the hot spots. This time of year too is great for snow geese. And I'll talk a little bit about those guys, and loons are moving as well. So here are some of the different flyways that waterfowl tend to move on. So we're in the Atlantic flyway. Oh, see, I had my Mississippi, and then Central is a little bit more western, and then the Pacific flyway. So waterfowl tend to follow it's like a highway, whereas songbirds are a little bit more dispersed, and songbirds will do this thing where they're like, I'm going to go this way, and then I'm going to go down here, and then I'm going to go out over the ocean, and then I'm going to go to the Dominican Republic. Whereas waterfowl are like, this is my road. They get on the freeway and they go. So hence we know a lot more about the patterns and the ways that they move. So we're kind of within this Atlantic flyway. And some of our birds are going to be moving out to the coast, but some of them are going to be using the Connecticut River and Lake Champlain to kind of move further south. So those are the places that you kind of want to go. So one of the interesting things is about how these birds move. So I talked about how songbirds like to move at night when the air is a little bit more stable and it's cooler on their bodies. So these are big birds, right? And hawks use thermals, and they have a break in between. And the big birds that have to really do a lot of flapping to power themselves need a whole different strategy. So this is where I failed physics in school, but if they had taught me physics through this, I probably wouldn't have failed. I would have been like, okay, that makes a lot of sense. So what's kind of happening is we have pressure from the top of the wing and the bottom of the wing. And there's a downwash that happens with the airflow that's coming off of the wing. And it actually kind of spins off the wingtip. That's why we get this bend in the wingtips. And that's why there's like fingers to the feathers on the tips of the wings so that the air can move through. So we've got the downwash and then the upwash that comes from that. So we get this little vortex that happens. And the reason why geese and ducks line up is to be able to draft each other and take advantage of that. So they're a little bit off to the side and they're a little bit up from the bird out in front of them. So everybody else gets the advantage of the vortex except for this bird that's doing all the work out in the front, right? And you've seen this before, right? Where that bird all of a sudden peels off and somebody else goes to the front. So they also take turns with who's going to break, basically like break the trail, you know, like we do during the winter time when we're snowshoeing. And it's really deep. And you're like, it's your turn, I'm done. Same thing is happening with these guys. So we see a lot of different shapes. We see V's and then we see echelons as well. But they're always lined up in this nice diagonal. And what we can't see is that the way the birds are stacked. So that they are taking really good advantage of the physics and the mechanics of flight. And you know, we use this same kind of science when we started designing planes and such. So learning from nature was one of the ways that we improved some of our technology. So these guys, these are hooded mergansers. Anybody seen these before? So these are predatory. These are fish-eating ducks. They've got a beak that's really good for grabbing small fish. They dive together, so this is the male and the female. When the male is in mating display, this whole set of feathers is like up on end, kind of like the female's is here. And this whole thing turns into this really nice kind of half moon shape on the top of the duck's head. Really beautiful. These guys are moving from our lakes now out to the ocean. As well as loons. And what's really kind of crazy during this time of year, and I had somebody just email me the other day and they were like, I saw like 18 loons all together. What's going on? Was that like a family of 18? And I was like, no, you don't see it. So that's multiple families. So they form these little social groups. And we're going to start to see this out on Lake Champlain now, where we have first-year birds. That's what these guys are with that plumage that's not complete yet. So they're kind of white and gray throughout. This one's almost in that full breeding plumage right there that we're really familiar with. But they form these big, huge social groups, and it's happening now on Lake Champlain. I know St. Albans Bay, the town park, is a really great place to go and see this. You make the drive out to Kilcare, and if you look, bring your binoculars, and you look out over the water, there's like tons of loons out there as we move into October. And then what they're going to do, they're all kind of staging and hanging out together, and then they're going to move to the ocean. For the winter time, and then they'll be back on all the little lakes all across the state in the spring. And then we got these guys, right? Who's gone to see snow geese before? Okay, so how many of you have gone to like Dead Creek to see the snow geese? Okay, anybody driven to the New York side of the lake? Yeah, so that's where the hot spot is now. Shh, don't tell anyone. But Addison used to be the spot where there were like tens of thousands of them.
That's where we were.
There's not as many anymore because they're all on the New York side of the lake. And what I really like about the New York side of the lake too is the roadways go right up against the water, and you're literally like roll the window down, and there you could almost grab one if you wanted to. They're like right there. So I would encourage you over the next couple weeks, like plan a day, go drive over to the New York side and just follow the roads along the shoreline there, and you'll probably come across these guys. If you want specific spots, eBird is a really great place to go. This is an online platform that birders upload their information to, and you can find where the hot spots are that they're being seen. Brian Pfeiffer also does a snow goose download. He keeps track and posts it on his blog. So that then you don't have to do any homework. You just go to Brian's site and he'll let you know where to go.
They haven't started yet, have they, Bridget?
I think there's probably drips and drabs. Typically it's like second week in October into November. Actually, I feel like it used to be the hot time was second week in October, and I feel like it's been getting later and later over the years. And maybe that's just because they've shifted where they are as well. But I led a trip last year, I think. it was in November to go see the ones over on the New York side of the lake. So see what we got, you know, we've got like fall migration of warblers, and then we got hawks, and then we got the waterfowl will be in there, and the geese, so it keeps you interested through the end of the year. And bird, there's always good stuff to go see. So let's talk about some tough birds. All right, anybody know this one? So Vermont Center for Eco Studies is really studying, yep, it is a thrush.
Some kind of a threat.
That's the high elevation thrush.
Hermit.
All right, so this is, and I seem to not have my notes for this one, so we'll just make it up as we go. So this is big nose thrush. These guys breed on mountaintops. So if you see here, these little green spots, these are the known breeding areas for this bird. So we have like the Tug Hill Plateau in New York, the Green Mountains, White Mountains and such into Maine. And then a few mountains in Maine, and then where are we up into, help me, in Canada, Nova Scotia, right? So this is a high elevation species of bird. That's the only place they breed. They're not going to come down into the lower forest to breed. They love that spruce fir forest. And where we know that they end up is down here in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, down here. But there's only very small spots where they are. So think about this, you're a bird that is a breeding specialist and a wintering specialist. So you're probably on the edge of not being around for a really long time. The good thing is that no one develops mountaintops, right? There's a lot of restrictions on developing mountaintops for the most part where these birds are breeding. So the places that they breed are already protected. But what they really wanted to start to figure out was how this bird was migrating and moving across the landscape. And so Vermont Center for Eco Studies started putting these little geolocators on the backs of birds with
Very
like dental
carefully.
floss. Yeah,
Really?
really carefully, like just tying them on there, okay? And so then you gotta catch the bird, put the backpack on it, and then release the bird, let it go for migration, and hopefully, and these guys, the scientists follow them, so they go to Haiti and the Dominican Republic during the winter, catch the birds, band them there. They use these very fine mist nets to catch them on their wintering ground. Maybe you catch one there so you're able to download some of the data. But then, again, you might also catch it when it comes back. And so Vermont Center for Eco Studies has been doing this for a number of years, and they have just started to be able to recapture some of these birds and get some of the data so that they can start to show where the birds are migrating and how they go out over the ocean to get to some of these islands on the fall migration, and how they kind of skip over, grab Florida and move up this way and make it a little bit easier on the way back. So pretty amazing to see that. Now, this is a larger bird, right? It's about the size of a robin. Robins are in the thrush family. So once they kind of played around with this and started to perfect the whole approach, they went for something smaller. And they went for something that has the most incredible migratory flight pattern that we didn't really know much about. Okay, so we're going from up here in New England, the northern forests, another mountaintop breeder, and we're going past all of those islands, and we're going to go to South America here. So in 2013, Vermont Center for Eco Studies captured blackpoll warblers in Vermont and Nova Scotia, put these little light level geolocators on them that are like little backpacks. And then they kind of tracked the birds as they migrated south in the fall and spent a winter in the tropics, and then returned in the spring to North American breeding sites. They recaptured 5 birds and removed the geolocators and downloaded their flight itineraries. So that's what you're seeing here. So this is bird A and bird B, bird C, D, and E. Okay? So this, look at this one. This is crazy, right? Right out over
Oh my goodness.
the ocean.
Wow.
So that's where that 50% body weight is really going to come into play, right?
Too.
So they departed from, 4 days, 5 days, right? Their flight times ranged from 49 to 73 hours, and each of the flights were roughly 1,600 miles.
Wow.
So they flew a day and a night over the Atlantic Ocean until landing in either Hispaniola or Puerto Rico. A fifth bird, which was also first captured in Vermont, took a shorter transoceanic route and departed the mainland on the 4th from Cape Hatteras and then flew nearly 1,000 miles nonstop for 18 hours to land in the Turks and Caicos before continuing to South America. On the return trip, right, so they had a couple birds that they were able to track the return trip. You can see
It's not in.
how they go from here and they hop to the islands and then they grab the Florida peninsula to be able to head up the coast. Look at this guy.
Come back?
Yep. Pardon me?
Did C not come back?
C may not have, I don't have that information here. So it may have lost the backpack. They may not have recaptured it.
Yeah,
It may not have made it,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
But we know from recent data now that there are more birds that are neotropical migrants that make it back than are short distance migrants that stay here in the continental United States or North America each year, which is really kind of fascinating. That a bird like this flying 1,600 miles, sending itself out over the ocean, this is just crazy, can make it there and back. So, yeah.
Do we know why they go so far? Why they need to go all the way?
Yeah, so why do they need to go all the way? So, during this time of year, that's when resources are depleted, right? So in North America, those food sources aren't going to be there. You've had all of these babies, that's more birds competing for less food, right? So they have to move and they have to distribute across, continents, right? To be able to feed
Carolina,
themselves.
Florida, they got top.
Yes, but there's still all of those other birds that are the short distance migrants or the middle distance migrants that are already there. So they just, right, so they're gonna spread out. Now, this is changing, right? We're seeing the effects of climate change. And some of this data that we're able to bring in now, and some of the data that comes actually from us as we report the birds that we see and we upload our data to eBird and we share what we're seeing across the landscape, we're seeing migration times shift. And National Audubon predicts that some birds that we think of as migrants are not going to be migrants in 50 years or more. So they will stay in place because things will have shifted that much that they won't need to leave anymore.
Because it's about the food. So
Because it's about the food, yep, so the food source will change. So that's a mind-blowing bird. So the next time you are hiking, or you're at the Missisquoi National Wildlife Refuge in the spring, early spring, these little blackpoll warblers stage at the refuge. It's amazing. I will never forget the first time I heard the song of a blackpoll warbler at the refuge in the spring in a wetland, and I was like, this is so wrong, right? I'm like, I know what this bird is. It's supposed to be up on top of Mount Mansfield or on top of JP. It's not supposed to be here. But if you think about it, when you're coming back and you're migrating, wetlands are bountiful in food. And so tons of birds are going to stage there before it's like, now it's time, I have that breeding restlessness, I need to get to the spot where I'm going to be able to find enough food for my young. I'm going to go to my niche, my spot, and that's where I'm going to breed. So you can see them at lower elevations early in the year. It's a really super cool bird. All right, so making a difference. So we talked a little bit about the seasonality of what all of these birds are doing, and I kind of hinted about landscape choices and things like that and trying to remove some invasive species off the land. So this time of year, one of the things that we can make sure to do is, have our bird feeders full, maybe leave our gardens messy a little bit longer, so that insects and seeds become available to these guys. Make sure there's water. I think about how dry a year it has been, so providing a bird bath. You were telling me about the fountains where you live and how birds are coming down to rest and bathe and get fresh water. Also thinking about the quality of winter habitat. So how many of you drink coffee? Yeah. How many of you drink bird-friendly coffee? No, what is
How
that?
would we know? How
Bird-
would we know?
So it'll have, so it'll have a little symbol on it, most likely from the Smithsonian Institute. There's a couple other organizations that put an insignia on the label that lets you know that it comes from a bird-friendly coffee plantation. So when we were talking about habitat changes and how that can really affect a population of neotropical migrants, when you make a coffee plantation, traditionally, it's a monoculture. And so all it is it's all coffee plants, and that's it. The trend now is to mix the coffee plants with native trees. They actually grow better, they're healthier. It's a lot like what we're experiencing with some of our sugar bushes here. When we manage them in a way that they're not a monoculture, the amount of product that we're able to pull off of them is actually greater, and it's healthier for birds and other wildlife. So same thing with coffee. You can actually buy bird-friendly maple syrup now, which Audubon Vermont created a program to certify sugar makers to manage their land in a way that's good for songbirds and for the health of their trees. And there's coffee now that you can buy, so you can feel happy in the morning when you're pouring your maple syrup, bird-friendly maple syrup, and your bird-friendly coffee. You're like, I'm doing something for those birds. The other thing you can do is turn your lights out at night. So don't leave that outside light on all the time. So lights tend to pull birds down. It kind of it throws them off, right? They don't know, they're not able to navigate in the way that they would in a dark sky. So turning lights off, and then also decreasing reflective surfaces. How many of you have had a bird hit a window before? Yeah, it's really interesting. A friend of mine is from Audubon is down in Washington, D.C. talking about some of the work that he's doing with landowners right now. And he and his colleagues just posted a picture of a chestnut-sided warbler on the sidewalk in the middle of the city next to a building with a lot of glass. So when we think of our cities too, urban landscapes that have lights on all the time, right? So that's why, what is it, St. Louis, the Arch in St. Louis, this year for the first time, they're gonna do lights out at night during migratory nights that they can look up on Birdcast, because they can say, ooh, this is a hot night for migrating birds. They're going to turn the lights out on the arch so that they don't kind of distract the birds from their job of getting north to south. I know, good stuff. And you can do that too. Another thing that we can do in our towns is really start to think big picture about how we are the nursery for some of these birds. Like this is the breeding place, the place that they come to have their young. So we can think of forest as infrastructure for our towns and also for the birds. So when we think of forest as a place that's going to absorb water in greater flood events, we're also going to be doing some really good stuff for birds. Big picture management, how do we not manage in our own little bubble, but we look across the landscape and see what's available there, and kind of think about managing together. Keeping forests unfragmented and wetlands unfragmented, keeping things kind of intact and large for these birds to be able to breed on. And then planning for climate change. There is a way that we can make our forests and different habitats a little bit more resilient. If we're landowners, there are ways to manage them so that they stay healthy. And they're going to be a little bit easier, they're going to have an easier time adapting as things shift and change, which will then make it easier for the birds that we love so much. So I want to thank you guys for coming out tonight. This is how you can get in touch with me. I do walks, I work with landowners, I do bird surveys and monitoring. I'd be happy to come and talk to you about how to just see your land through different eyes if you'd like, and maybe through the eyes of the birds that you're seeing as they visit your backyard. And I'd be happy to take any questions that you have.